The spotlight caught him mid-stride as Terrence Bishop walked across the polished stage of Lincoln Center's David Geffen Hall. 5 of the world's most distinguished orchestra conductors sat in the front row, their faces betraying nothing but professional curiosity tinged with skepticism. They had heard the rumors, read the viral videos, seen the headlines, but none of them truly believed what they were about to witness. Terrence settled onto the piano bench with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove, yet everything to share. His fingers hovered over the keys of the Steinway Model D Concert Grand, and in that suspended moment before sound, the hall held its breath. What happened next would challenge everything these maestros thought they knew about music, about performance, about the very nature of sound itself. Because Terrence Bishop was about to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, and he couldn't hear a single note, not one. Terrence had been completely deaf for 35 years. The question burning in everyone's mind was simple, impossible, unavoidable. How to understand the answer, we need to go back. Back to a moment that should have ended everything, but instead became the beginning of something extraordinary. South Side, Chicago, 1989. 7-year-old Terrence Bishop sat at an upright piano in the living room of a modest 2-bedroom apartment, his small fingers dancing across ivory keys that had seen better days. The piano was out of tune, one of the pedals stuck, and 3 of the keys only worked if you hit them just right. But to Terrence, it was perfect. His mother, Angela Bishop, stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, watching her son with the kind of pride that only a parent can know. Angela sang gospel at New Hope Baptist Church every Sunday, her voice a force of nature that could shake the rafters and move hearts in equal measure. She had started teaching Terrence piano when he was 4, and by 7, he was already showing the kind of natural talent that made people stop and take notice. "Baby, that's beautiful," Angela called out, her voice warm with encouragement. "But remember what I told you about the left hand. It's not just playing notes, it's the heartbeat. Everything else dances around that heartbeat." Terrence nodded, adjusted his posture the way his mother had taught him, and tried again. This time, the simple hymn he was practicing seemed to come alive, the melody soaring while his left hand provided that steady, grounding pulse. Music wasn't just something Terrence enjoyed. It was the language through which he understood the world. While other kids his age were outside playing basketball or riding bikes, Terrence could sit at that piano for hours, lost in exploration, in discovery, in pure joy. "You're going to be something special," Angela would tell him, running her hand over his close-cropped hair. "I can feel it in my bones." She had no idea how prophetic those words would become, or how much pain would stand between that moment and their fulfillment. 3 weeks later, on a wet November evening, Angela was driving Terrence home from his piano lesson with Mrs. Chen, a retired concert pianist who lived on the north side. The rain was coming down hard, the kind of Chicago downpour that turns streets into rivers and makes visibility almost zero. Angela was being careful hands at 10, and 2, driving well under the speed limit. The other driver wasn't. He ran the red light at 60 miles an hour, his truck plowing into the passenger side of Angela's sedan with the force of a wrecking ball. The sound of twisting metal and shattering glass filled the intersection. Angela's car spun twice before slamming into a light post. When Terrence woke up 3 days later in the hospital, his mother was sitting beside his bed, her face a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked like grief. "Baby," she whispered, taking his hand. "Can you hear me?" Terrence tried to answer, but something was wrong. He could see his mother's lips moving, see the tears streaming down her face. But there was nothing. No sound. Just silence. Absolute, complete, suffocating silence. He couldn't hear the beeping of the hospital monitors. Couldn't hear the nurses walking past his room. Couldn't hear his own voice when he tried to scream. The doctors explained it with clinical detachment. Severe head trauma. Bilateral damage to the auditory nerves. Permanent and irreversible hearing loss. At 7 years old, Terrence Bishop had entered a world of absolute silence. And the medical consensus was clear: he would never hear again. But it was the neurologist who delivered the cruelest blow, speaking to Angela outside Terrence's room, not knowing the boy could read lips well enough to understand. Given the severity of the damage, any career in music is completely off the table. The neural pathways that process sound are destroyed. I'm sorry, Mrs. Bishop. Your son's musical dreams are over before they really began. Angela cried for 3 days straight. Not for herself, though she felt guilty about that too, but for her son, for the gift that had been stolen from him for the future, that had been ripped away by a drunk driver who walked away from the accident with nothing but a broken arm. Terrence didn't cry. He was too numb, too lost in the oppressive silence that now defined his existence. The world had become a silent film, all visual information with no audio track. He went through the motions of recovery physical therapy, learning sign language, adjusting to his new reality. But inside, something was breaking. Or perhaps something was being forged. 6 months after the accident, Angela found Terrence in his room, sitting on his bed, staring at the wall. She sat down beside him, took his hand, and signed what she had been signing every day since the accident. I love you. We'll get through this. Terrence turned to his mother, and for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, his eyes held something other than emptiness. They held fire. He signed back his hands, moving with fierce determination. Music is in my soul, not my ears. I'm not done. Angela didn't understand what he meant. Not yet, but she would. 3 years passed. Terrence was 10 years old now, attending a school for deaf children, learning and adapting and surviving, but not thriving. Never thriving. There was a hollowness in him that his mother recognized, a grief that hadn't healed, because the wound was still fresh every single day. The piano in their living room sat untouched, a monument to what was lost. Angela couldn't bring herself to get rid of it, but she had covered it with a sheet, unable to bear looking at it, without remembering her son's joy. One afternoon, Angela was practicing a new hymn for Sunday service, singing along with a recording completely absorbed in the music. She didn't notice Terrence standing in the doorway of the living room watching her, and she didn't notice when he walked over to the piano, pulled off the sheet, and sat down. It was only when she felt the vibrations through the floor that she turned around. Terrence had his hands on the piano, not on the keys, but on the wooden case itself. His eyes were closed, his face completely still, concentrated. Angela stopped singing, confusion and concern flooding through her. But then she saw his expression change. His eyes opened wide with something that looked almost like recognition. Like someone who had been lost in the dark for years and just glimpsed a distant light. He moved his hands to the keys and pressed middle C. The vibration traveled through the instrument, through the floor, through his entire body. And Terrence smiled, really smiled for the first time in 3 years. He pressed another key, then another. Random notes at first, just feeling the vibrations, cataloging them, understanding them in a way that had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with sensation. Angela watched frozen, not daring to move, not wanting to break whatever spell had taken hold of her son. Terrence played for 20 minutes straight, not creating music, not yet, but rediscovering a language he thought he had lost. When he finally stopped, he turned to his mother with tears streaming down his face and signed, "I can feel it, Mama. I can feel the music." That was the beginning. What followed was a journey that would test the limits of human determination and redefine what seemed possible. Terrence became obsessed approaching the piano, not as he had before, but as a completely new instrument that spoke a different language. Not the language of sound, but the language of vibration, of physics, of energy transfer. He would sit at the piano for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, teaching himself to feel the differences between notes, to sense rhythm, through the vibrations that pulsed through his body, to understand harmony by the way different frequencies interacted in the air and in his bones. Angela encouraged him, but she was also terrified. She didn't want to watch her son build up hope, only to have it crushed again. But she also couldn't deny the transformation she was witnessing. The hollow grief that had defined Terrence for 3 years was being replaced by something fierce and beautiful purpose. When Terrence was 12, Angela took him to see Dr. Robert Martinez, a neurologist who specialized in sensory processing. She needed to know if what Terrence was attempting was even theoretically possible, or if she was watching her son chase an impossible dream. Dr. Martinez examined Terrence, ran tests, asked questions. Finally, he sat back in his chair and looked at Angela with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Bishop, what your son is doing is extraordinary. He's essentially rewired his brain to process musical information through tactile and proprioceptive channels instead of auditory ones. The vibrations from the piano travel through his hands, through his body, even through his feet on the floor. His brain is learning to interpret these physical sensations as musical information." "So it's possible," Angela asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. "He could actually play music again?" Dr. Martinez hesitated. "The human brain is more adaptable than we often give it credit for. Could he play simple pieces? Perhaps. But we're talking about an entirely different way of processing music. The complexity, the speed, the nuance required for professional performance. I honestly don't know if it's achievable." He turned to Terrence, who had been reading his lips intently. "Young man, what you're attempting has never been done before, at least not at any serious level. You're trying to create a new paradigm, a new way of interfacing with music. It's going to be incredibly difficult. Most people would tell you it's impossible." Terrence signed his response, and Angela translated, "Then I guess I'll be the first." Dr. Martinez smiled despite himself. "I believe you just might try." Over the next 5 years, Terrence developed his technique with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsessive. He learned that different frequencies created different physical sensations. Low notes created deep, resonant vibrations he could feel in his chest and stomach. High notes created lighter, faster vibrations he sensed more in his hands and arms. He learned to feel rhythm through the pattern of vibrations pulsing through the floor and up through his feet. But it wasn't enough to just feel the notes. He had to understand music theory at a level most hearing musicians never achieved. He devoured books on composition harmony counterpoint. He studied scores with an intensity that would have impressed any conservatory professor. He taught himself to read music not as sounds to be heard, but as mathematical relationships between frequencies, as patterns of vibration to be felt and understood. By the time he was 15, Terrence could play simple classical pieces with reasonable accuracy. By 17, he was tackling intermediate repertoire, but he knew he needed help, real professional instruction, if he was going to go further. Finding a teacher willing to work with a deaf pianist proved nearly impossible. Angela spent 2 years writing letters, making phone calls, attending music schools and conservatories across Chicago. The answer was always the same, sympathetic but firm rejection. We admire his determination, but without hearing, he simply cannot achieve the level of musicianship required for serious study. It was Helena Grant who finally said yes. Helena was 72 years old, a former concert pianist whose career had been cut short by arthritis in her hands. She had spent the last 30 years teaching, and she had developed a reputation for taking on students that others had given up on. When Angela brought Terrence to Helena's studio, a converted warehouse loft, in a sketchy neighborhood on the west side, the old woman spent 2 hours just watching him play, not saying a word, just observing. Finally, she stood up, walked over to the piano, and signed she had learned ASL years ago for another student. "Play me something you've memorized. Anything." Terrence chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece he had spent 6 months learning through vibration, through feel, through pure determination. He played it from beginning to end, his eyes closed, his entire body engaged with the instrument in a way that went far beyond normal piano technique. His feet were bare, pressed flat against the floor, feeling every vibration. His posture was perfect, allowing the instrument's vibrations to resonate through his torso. His hands moved across the keys with a precision that came from thousands of hours of practice. When he finished, Helena was quiet for a long moment. Then she signed, "You're playing the notes correctly. The rhythm is mostly accurate. The technique is decent." Terrence's face fell. It sounded like a prelude to rejection. But then Helena smiled a fierce, bright smile that transformed her weathered face. "But that's not what impressed me. What impressed me is that you're feeling the music, not just mechanically reproducing it, but actually feeling it. I've had students with perfect pitch who couldn't do that. Yes, I'll teach you, but I'm going to push you harder than any student I've ever had. Because what you're attempting isn't just difficult, it's revolutionary." For the next 7 years, Terrence studied with Helena 5 days a week, sometimes 6. She didn't coddle him or make excuses for his deafness. She pushed him to develop his technique to a level that would make his method of playing not just viable, but virtuosic. "You have to be better than hearing pianists," she told him, signing with her gnarled hands. "Not because you need to prove anything, but because you're working with limitations they don't have. Your margin for error is smaller. Your preparation has to be more thorough. Your understanding of the music has to be deeper." Terrence absorbed every lesson, every correction, every insight. He learned to compensate for his inability to hear dynamics by developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to the physical feedback from the instrument. He learned to feel when he was rushing or dragging tempo by the pattern of vibrations pulsing through his body. He learned to sense harmony and dissonance through the way different frequencies interacted physically in the air around him. But more than technique, Helena taught him about music as a language of emotion and expression that transcended sound. "Music isn't just about what you hear," she would tell him. "It's about what you feel, what you communicate, what you share with your audience. Sound is just one way to transmit that information. You're finding another way." By the time Terrence was 25, he was playing repertoire that professional pianists spent years mastering. Chopin's Etudes, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsodies, Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata. Each piece was a mountain to climb, requiring months of practice, but Terrence climbed them all. He started performing at local venues. Churches, community centers, small recital halls. The audiences were initially skeptical, then curious, then amazed. Word spread. The deaf pianist from South Side Chicago, who played through vibrations, who had taught himself to interface with music in a way no one had ever seen before. A video of one of his performances went viral. Someone had filmed him playing Chopin's revolutionary Etude at a community center, and the footage captured not just his playing, but his unique relationship with the instrument. The way his entire body engaged with the music. The way he seemed to be feeling rather than hearing every note. The video got 3 million views in the first week, then 10 million. National news picked it up. The story was too compelling, too unusual, too inspiring to ignore. That's when the email came. It was from the artistic director of Lincoln Center in New York City. They were organizing a special showcase featuring unconventional musicians, artists, who were pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in classical music. They wanted Terrence to audition for a spot in the program. But this wasn't going to be a simple audition. The panel would consist of 5 of the world's most respected orchestra conductors. Maestros who had led the Berlin Philharmonic, the Vienna State Opera, the London Symphony Orchestra. These were musicians at the absolute pinnacle of the classical music world. And they would be judging whether Terrence Bishop, a deaf pianist from Chicago, who played through vibrations, deserved to perform at Carnegie Hall. The audition was scheduled for March 15th. Terrence had 6 months to prepare. He chose Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, widely considered one of the most technically and emotionally demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. It was an audacious choice, some would say arrogant. But Terrence understood something fundamental. If he was going to prove that his method wasn't just a novelty, wasn't just an inspiring story, he had to demonstrate mastery at the highest level. The preparation was grueling. Terrence worked with Helena 8 hours a day, sometimes more. They broke down every measure, every phrase, every dynamic marking. Terrence had to memorize not just the notes, but the precise physical sensation of each section, the pattern of vibrations that corresponded to every passage. The Rachmaninoff Concerto is nearly 40 minutes long, containing some of the most complex piano writing ever composed. The technical demands are extreme rapid octave passages, thick chordal sections, delicate melodic lines that require perfect control, and all of it has to flow together with seamless musicality and emotional depth. For a hearing pianist, it's a career-defining challenge. For someone who couldn't hear a single note, it seemed almost impossible. But Terrence had spent his entire life proving that impossible was just a word. The night before he left for New York, Angela sat with her son in their living room. The same room where he had first discovered music at age 4, the same room where he had rediscovered it at age 10. "Are you nervous?" she signed. Terrence considered the question. "Terrified," he signed back, "but also ready. Everything I've done for the last 18 years has been leading to this moment." Angela reached out and took his hand. "Your father would be so proud," she signed. Terrence's father had died when he was 3, long before the accident, but Angela knew he was watching somehow. "What if I fail?" Terrence signed. "What if I get up there and all my preparation isn't enough? What if I prove all the doubters right?" Angela stood up, walked over to the piano, and placed her hand on its wooden case. "This piano has been in our family for 40 years, she signed. "It was your grandmother's before it was mine. It's seen joy and sorrow and everything in between. When you were 4 years old, you sat at this instrument and played your first notes. When you were 10, you sat here and felt vibrations for the first time and refused to give up on your dream." She turned back to her son, her eyes fierce with love and pride. "You've already succeeded, baby. Everything that happens tomorrow is just sharing that success with the world. Now go show those conductors what music really means." March 15th arrived cold and gray, with the kind of New York wind that cuts through coats and reminds you that winter isn't quite done. Terrence stood outside Lincoln Center, looking up at the iconic building, trying to slow his racing heart. Inside, in one of the smaller performance halls, the panel of 5 conductors was assembling. Maestro Klaus Brenner from Germany, 70 years old, and considered by many to be the greatest living interpreter of romantic repertoire. Maestro Sarah Chen from Singapore, the first woman to lead the Vienna State Opera. Maestro Antonio Rossi from Italy, famous for his passionate, dramatic conducting style. Maestro Jean-Pierre Dubois from France, known for his intellectual, analytical approach to music. And Maestro Patricia Williams from the United States, a Chicago native who had mentored some of the finest musicians of the last 3 decades. They had all read the briefing materials about Terrence Bishop. They knew he was deaf. They knew his method was unorthodox, and to varying degrees they were all skeptical. "I admire the human interest story," Maestro Brenner said, settling into his seat. "But Lincoln Center isn't a venue for inspiring anecdotes. It's a venue for world-class artistry. The question is whether this young man can actually deliver at that level." Maestro Williams, who had followed Terrence's story more closely than the others, bristled slightly. "Perhaps we should listen before we judge Klaus." "I'm not prejudging," Brenner replied. "I'm simply being realistic. Playing piano without hearing is like painting without seeing. It's a fundamentally compromised endeavor." "Beethoven composed some of his greatest works while deaf," Maestro Chen pointed out. "Composed, yes," Maestro Rossi interjected. "But he had years of musical training and auditory memory to draw from before he lost his hearing. This young man has been deaf since childhood. He has no auditory memory of music to rely on, which makes what he's attempting all the more remarkable," Maestro Dubois said thoughtfully. "If he can actually play at a professional level, he's essentially created a new methodology from scratch." "A big if," Brenner muttered. The conversation died as the door opened and Terrence entered the performance hall. He was wearing a simple black suit, white shirt, no tie. His close-cropped hair was neat, his posture straight. He looked calm, but his hands were trembling slightly. The hall itself was intimate, maybe 200 seats, though only the 5 conductors were present. The piano was a magnificent Steinway Model D 9 feet of perfectly crafted instrument, the same type used in the world's greatest concert halls. Maestro Williams stood and signed a greeting. Terrence had been told she knew ASLA relief in a situation already fraught with anxiety. "Mr. Bishop, welcome. We've been looking forward to your audition. You'll be playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, correct?" Terrence signed his confirmation, and Williams translated for the others. "Before you begin," Maestro Brenner said, his voice carrying a note of challenge, "I have a question. How do you ensure accurate tempo without hearing? How do you know if you're rushing or dragging?" Maestro Williams translated, and Terrence responded in sign language, which she interpreted, "I feel the pulse through vibrations. Each note creates a physical sensation. Rhythm is a pattern of those sensations. I've trained my body to internalize tempo the way a hearing person trains their ear." Brenner's expression remained skeptical, but he nodded. "Very well. Please begin." Terrence walked to the piano, each step measured, controlled. His heart was pounding so hard he wondered if the conductors could see it. This was it. Everything came down to the next 40 minutes. He sat on the bench, adjusted the height, slightly positioned himself at the perfect distance from the keys. He removed his shoes. This had raised eyebrows when mentioned in his briefing materials, but it was essential. His bare feet on the floor allowed him to feel the vibrations through the entire hall, giving him additional tactile information about the music. He closed his eyes, took 3 deep breaths, and placed his hands on the keys. The opening of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto begins with a series of dramatic chords, deep and resonant. Terrence struck the first chord, and the vibration traveled through his hands, through the piano, through the floor, through his entire body. He had played these chords 10,000 times in preparation, but this time was different. This time, everything mattered. He continued with the opening sequence, 8 powerful chords that announced the concerto's grand romantic character. Each chord was perfectly voiced, the balance between bass and treble exactly right, the rhythm precise. In the audience, Maestro Chen leaned forward slightly. The touch was good, more than good. It was refined, controlled, musical. Terrence moved into the first melodic theme, his right hand singing out the iconic melody, while his left hand provided rich harmonic support. This was the test: could he play? Not just accurately, but musically. Could he phrase the melody with the kind of shape and direction that separated competent playing from artistry? The answer was yes. His phrasing was natural breathing in all the right places, building toward climaxes and pulling back for moments of intimacy. His dynamics, the variation between loud and soft, were subtle and expressive, not the heavy-handed extremes of an amateur, but the nuanced shading of someone who truly understood the music. Maestro Rossi's eyebrows rose. This was not what he had expected. As Terrence progressed through the first movement, something remarkable became apparent to the panel. He wasn't just playing notes. He was interpreting, making musical decisions, shaping the piece with clear artistic intent. "Impossible," Maestro Brenner muttered under his breath, but there was no longer skepticism in his voice. Just wonder. The concerto moved into its more technically demanding sections. Rapid passages where both hands fly across the keyboard in opposite directions. Complex rhythmic patterns that require perfect coordination. Thick chordal sections that demand both power and precision. Terrence navigated it all with a combination of technical mastery and deep musicality. His hands moved across the keys with balletic grace, finding each note with unerring accuracy. His body swayed slightly with the music, not in an exaggerated performative way, but naturally, organically, as if the vibrations were moving through him and he was simply channeling them back through the instrument. Maestro Williams felt tears forming in her eyes. She was watching something she had never seen before, something she would have said was impossible if someone had described it to her. This young man was doing more than playing piano. He was redefining what it meant to make music. The first movement concluded with a powerful cadence, and Terrence paused, taking a breath before moving into the second movement. This movement is slower, more introspective, featuring one of the most beautiful melodies Rachmaninoff ever wrote. It requires a different kind of playing, less about technical fireworks, more about sustaining a singing line, creating an atmosphere of tender longing. Terrence's hands moved to the keys, and the melody emerged with heartbreaking beauty. Each note was weighted perfectly, the connection between them seamless. It was the kind of playing that makes audiences forget they're listening to a machine made of wood and steel and wire, and instead feel like they're hearing a human voice speaking directly to their soul. Maestro Dubois was no longer analyzing. He was simply listening, completely absorbed in the music. His analytical mind, which usually dissected performances into component parts, had gone quiet. He was experiencing the piece emotionally, viscerally, in a way he hadn't in years. How was this possible? How could someone who couldn't hear create something so profoundly musical, so deeply expressive? The answer, though the conductors didn't fully understand it yet, was that Terrence had found a different path to the same destination. Hearing musicians use auditory feedback to shape their playing, constantly adjusting based on what they hear. Terrence used tactile feedback, feeling the vibrations, sensing the resonance, understanding the physics of sound through his body rather than his ears. But more than that, he had developed a relationship with music that was purely emotional and intellectual. He understood the score not as sounds to be produced, but as emotions to be conveyed, as a structure of tension and release, of question and answer, of journey and arrival. His deafness had forced him to engage with music at a level that transcended the merely auditory. As the second movement drew to its close, Maestro Chen reached up and wiped away a tear. She wasn't ashamed. This was why she had dedicated her life to music for moments like this, when art reaches past all barriers and touches something essential in the human experience. The third movement is the concerto's grand finale, energetic, triumphant, technically explosive. It demands everything from the pianist's speed power, delicacy, endurance, and absolute precision. Terrence launched into it with fierce joy. His hands raced across the keyboard, executing passages that would challenge any professional pianist. The famous octave runs where both hands play parallel lines 2 octaves apart at breakneck speed. The thunderous climaxes where the entire keyboard seems to erupt in sound. The delicate dancing sections that require a light, precise touch. But it wasn't just the technical achievement that left the panel in awe. It was the musicality, the artistry, the sheer life force that poured out of the piano. Terrence wasn't performing for them. He was sharing something deeply personal, a joy that had been earned through years of struggle and determination. The concerto built toward its final climax, the music surging with romantic grandeur. Terrence's entire body was engaged, now swaying with the rhythm, his face showing the emotional journey of the piece. This wasn't just about physical sensation anymore. He was completely immersed in the music, lost in a world of vibration and energy and expression. The final measures approached the concerto, racing toward its triumphant conclusion. Terrence's hands flew across the keys, his bare feet pressing into the floor, feeling every vibration resonating through the hall. The last series of chords built in intensity, each one more powerful than the last, the musical equivalent of a rocket launching skyward. And then the final chord, massive, resonant, definitive. Terrence held it, letting it ring out, feeling the vibrations slowly decay, the energy dissipating into silence. He lifted his hands from the keys and sat perfectly still, eyes closed, chest heaving with exertion and emotion. In the audience, 5 of the world's greatest conductors sat in stunned silence. Maestro Brenner's face had completely transformed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something like reverence. His hands were trembling. Maestro Rossi was crying openly, not bothering to hide his tears. Maestro Dubois was shaking his head slowly, not in negation, but in wonder, as if trying to process what he had just witnessed. Maestro Chen had her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. And Maestro Williams was sobbing, her entire body shaking with the force of her emotion. It was Williams who moved first. She stood up and began to applaud, her hands coming together in sharp, emphatic claps. The others joined her immediately, all 5 conductors rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Terrence opened his eyes and saw them standing, saw their faces, saw the tears. He couldn't hear their applause, but he could feel it, the vibration of their hands coming together, the energy of their response traveling through the floor to where he sat. For a moment he couldn't move. The enormity of what had just happened crashed over him like a wave. All the years of practice, all the doubt, all the people who had told him it was impossible, all the nights he had wanted to give up, but didn't. It all led to this moment. Slowly, he stood and bowed, tears streaming down his own face. Maestro Williams walked up to the stage, signed to him. That was transcendent. Not just good, Not just impressive, transcendent. The other conductors gathered around, and Williams translated as they spoke. "I need to apologize," Maestro Brenner said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came here skeptical, almost cynical. I thought this would be an interesting curiosity at best. But what you just did, you didn't just play Rachmaninoff's Concerto. You revealed something about it I've never heard before. You made me understand the piece in a new way." Maestro Rossi stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Italian, which Williams translated, "I have conducted this concerto with some of the finest pianists in the world. Oscar winners, Grammy winners, legendary artists. And I can say without hesitation that your interpretation stands alongside the very best. The technical mastery was extraordinary, but it was your emotional depth that moved me. You weren't showing off. You were sharing something profound." Maestro Chen was next. "I want to understand," she said. "How is this possible? How do you achieve such precise dynamics, such perfect phrasing without auditory feedback?" Terrence signed his response, and Williams translated, "Music isn't just sound, it's vibration, it's energy, it's mathematics, it's emotion. I feel all of those things. The piano speaks to me through touch, through the resonance in my body, through the patterns I've learned to recognize. I might not hear the notes, but I understand them. I feel them, and that's enough." Maestro Dubois nodded slowly. "You've created a new paradigm," he said. "You've proven that music can be accessed through different pathways than we assumed. This has implications beyond just your personal achievement. You're expanding our understanding of what music is and how it can be experienced." There was a long pause, and then Maestro Williams spoke again, this time on behalf of the entire panel. "Mr. Bishop, we were supposed to decide today whether you would be invited to perform at Lincoln Center. But I think I speak for all of us when I say that question is no longer relevant. You don't just deserve to perform at Lincoln Center. You deserve to perform at every major concert hall in the world. Your artistry is at the highest level. Your story is inspiring, yes, but that's secondary to the simple fact that you are a world-class musician." She paused, glanced at her colleagues, who all nodded their agreement, then continued. "We would like to offer you not just a single performance, but a multi-city tour. Carnegie Hall, yes, but also Symphony Hall in Boston, the Kennedy Center in Washington, Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. We want to arrange performances with major orchestras where you can perform concertos with full orchestral accompaniment. This is not charity. This is not inspiration. This is recognition of genuine artistry." Terrence stared at them, unable to process what he was hearing. A tour. Multiple performances. Major orchestras. Everything he had worked toward for 18 years. Everything he had dreamed about being offered to him in a single moment. He signed a single word yes. That evening, Terrence sat in his hotel room in Manhattan, staring at his phone. He had already called his mother, who had screamed and cried and praised God, and told him she always knew, she always believed. He had called Helena, his teacher, who had simply said, "You did it, kid. You really did it." Her voice cracking with pride. Now he was looking at social media, watching the story explode in real time. Someone from Lincoln Center had leaked news of the audition. The hashtag Terrence Bishop was trending worldwide. Videos from his previous performances were being shared millions of times. News outlets were picking up the story. The narrative was irresistible. Deaf pianist defies all odds, stuns world's top conductors, earns multi-city tour. But Terrence knew the story was more complex than that. It wasn't just about defying odds or overcoming disability. It was about reimagining what was possible, about finding alternative pathways to the same destination, about the fundamental truth that art transcends the specific methods of its creation. He thought about 7-year-old Terrence sitting at that upright piano in Chicago before the accident, when music was just joy and discovery. He thought about 10-year-old Terrence placing his hands on the piano for the first time after the accident, feeling those vibrations, refusing to accept that his story with music was over. He thought about all the hours of practice, the failures, the small victories, the people who believed in him, and the people who didn't. He thought about his mother's unwavering support, Helena's demanding teaching, Dr. Martinez's cautious encouragement. And he realized that the journey had been the point all along. The performance at Lincoln Center was wonderful. The tour would be amazing. The recognition was validating. But the real achievement was in the work itself, in the daily commitment to a dream that everyone said was impossible, in the refusal to accept limitations as permanent boundaries. Music had saved him. Not because it gave him back what he lost in that accident, but because it gave him something to build, something to strive toward, something that made the silence bearable and eventually beautiful. His phone buzzed with another message, this one from a music school in Chicago. They wanted to start a program for deaf students interested in music, and they wanted Terrence's input on curriculum development. They wanted to create pathways for other students like him. He smiled and typed a response. I'd be honored. 6 months later, Carnegie Hall in New York City was sold out. Every single seat filled a waiting list of thousands who couldn't get tickets. The audience included everyone from classical music aficionados to people who had never attended a concert before, but were drawn by Terrence's story. Backstage, Terrence stood in the wings watching the orchestra take their positions. The New York Philharmonic, one of the finest orchestras in the world. And tonight, they would accompany him in a full performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Maestro Patricia Williams would conduct. It seemed fitting somehow that a fellow Chicago native would lead this historic performance. Angela was in the audience front row center wearing her Sunday best and clutching a handkerchief. Helena was there too, her arthritic hands folded in her lap, her eyes bright with pride. The house lights dimmed. The audience fell silent. Maestro Williams walked on stage to applause, then gestured for Terrence to join her. He walked out into the spotlight, and the ovation was immediate and thunderous. People were standing before he even reached the piano, their applause washing over him in waves he could feel, even if he couldn't hear. He bowed, sat at the piano, removed his shoes, positioned himself perfectly. Williams raised her baton, made eye contact with Terrence, and gave him a nod. Terrence placed his hands on the keys, closed his eyes, and felt for the vibration that would signal the orchestra's entrance. When it came, he was ready. The first chord rang out, and the journey began again. But this time, it wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about overcoming odds or defying expectations. It was simply about sharing the music, about communicating across the barriers of sound and silence to touch something universal in the human experience. As Terrence played, as his hands moved across the keys with grace and power, as the orchestra swelled around him, in harmonies he could feel in his bones, he understood something fundamental about his journey. Music had never been about hearing. It had always been about feeling, about connection, about the energy that flows between performer and audience, between composer and interpreter, between the silence and the sound. He had spent 18 years learning to play piano without hearing. But what he had really learned was something deeper, that the essence of music exists independent of the specific senses we use to access it. That beauty and emotion and meaning can travel through vibration just as surely as through sound waves. that the human spirit has infinite capacity for adaptation, for finding new paths, for refusing to accept that doors are permanently closed. The concerto built toward its climax, and Terrence felt every moment of it. The orchestra around him, the piano beneath his hands, the audience holding its collective breath, all of it converging in a moment of pure artistic communion. The final chords approached. Terrence's hands raced toward the ending feeling, the pattern of vibrations he had memorized so thoroughly. Each note a physical sensation, each phrase a conversation between his body and the instrument. And then the last chord, triumphant, powerful, definitive. The ending Rachmaninoff had written more than a century ago, now being experienced in a way the composer could never have imagined. Terrence held the final chord, feeling it resonate through the hall, through the piano, through his entire being. He held it until the vibration faded completely, until there was nothing left but silence. And in that silence, he smiled. Because silence wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't loss or limitation. It was simply the space between the vibrations, the canvas on which all music was painted, the foundation from which all beauty emerged. He opened his eyes and looked out at the audience. They were on their feet, their hands moving in applause he couldn't hear, but could feel their faces showing every emotion: joy, wonder, tears, celebration. Maestro Williams was crying again, not bothering to hide it. The orchestra members were standing and applauding something that almost never happened during a performance. Terrence stood and bowed, and as he did, he thought about that 7-year-old boy who had first fallen in love with music. He thought about the accident that should have ended everything. He thought about the 10-year-old who refused to give up. He thought about every person who had told him it was impossible, and every person who had believed it wasn't. And he thought about every person, in every audience, past and future, who would hear his story and understand its real message, that limitations are often illusions, that the human capacity for adaptation and innovation is boundless, that what seems impossible is often just unexplored. The standing ovation continued for 5 full minutes. Terrence bowed again and again, feeling the vibration of thousands of hands coming together, feeling the energy of their appreciation and wonder washing over him like waves. Finally, he walked off stage, his heart full, his purpose clear. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. There would be more performances, more cities, more audiences. But more importantly, there would be students. Young deaf children who loved music and thought their dreams were impossible. He would show them the path he had found, help them discover their own methods, their own ways of accessing the art they loved. Because that was the real point of everything he had achieved. Not personal glory, though that was nice. Not fame or recognition, though those had their place. The point was to expand what was considered possible, to open doors that had been closed, to prove that there are always alternative paths to any destination worth reaching. Music wasn't just sound. It was vibration. It was energy. It was emotion. It was mathematics and physics and poetry, all woven together. And it could be accessed through infinite pathways, limited only by imagination and determination. Terrence Bishop had spent 18 years proving that truth. And now, standing backstage at Carnegie Hall after the performance of a lifetime, he was ready to spend the rest of his life teaching it to anyone who needed to hear it, or feel it. Because in the end, They were the same thing.